Hi guys, welcome to Snakes and Adders. This is a little video that we put together in response to a video released by Responsible Reptile Keeping. Were they right to take the angle that they did? And I thought it was worthy of further discussion. One of the videos that they produced, just took a screen grab and printed it, why you shouldn't breed boas. And in that, it's an excerpt from a far longer video, which will no doubt be released as a podcast featuring Chris Newman, who is the chairman of Reptile and Exotic Pet Trade Association, and the director of the National Centre for Reptile Welfare. He was being interviewed by Tony Wigley. Some people might know him as Tony Jones in a previous life of Responsible Reptile Keeping. And the excerpt centres around how common boas are problematic in the hobby from a rescue perspective. And it's important that we put that perspective in there. Chris is there in his capacity as the director of the National Centre for Reptile Welfare, and the single most problematic taxa that they have is common boas or boa imperata. There was some consternation, a couple of posts, and I thought it's worth exploring. And it isn't necessarily to denigrate the people that challenged it, but maybe to open up the discussion by which, we'll leave the comments open, and, the back and forth is important because as a hobby, communication hasn't always been our strongest suit, and it's trying to decipher what they're trying to achieve from the video and then explain what the concerns of the people that have raised the issues may well be, and if there's validity to it, and whether we can find a way through it. The single biggest issue for me within the hobby is the fractured nature of it, and that a unifying force or voice is often absent from being able to move forwards. Equally, I've had a long-standing issue with the idea that any problems we may have as a hobby or as an industry, we brush under the carpet and don't discuss. And that for me is a problem as well, simply because to be able to acknowledge that there is an issue, to be able to acknowledge that there's something we could improve upon, isn't a bad thing. And part of the argument levied is you're putting bullets in guns. I think we're taking bullets out of guns because there's now a public record of us trying to deal with something or discuss something or raise it as a potential issue. Let's just raise this little red flag and have a discussion, and where do we go from here? If you haven't watched the video, it's definitely worth watching. They're just being released as short excerpts for now, with the longer podcast due to arrive later on. And what's covered in it, I don't know. I'm not privy to that, but I can only comment on the videos as they're released. And the opportunity to have the discussion and think about it and try and approach it from a cerebral angle and all the rest of it, I think is important. Lots of knee-jerk reactions, lots of people, whether they've got skin in the game or not, or they just don't like the idea of the hobby being questioned in any way. But to me, that sometimes comes across as just putting your fingers in your ears, la, 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 I'm not listening. So, the easiest way for me to deal with this, Faye Costa, who's a FBH board member, so Federation of British Herpetologists, said about the video, this is absolutely sending the wrong message. Your page should be supporting keepers, not telling them what to do or what not to breed. If a keeper wants to breed any species, they should be advised that they may well need to keep the babies indefinitely or rehome them without monetary value. All keepers should be allowed the opportunity to experience breeding the species they want to. There are numerous subspecies, localities, and morphs of boa constrictor that are in high demand that will find a home. And I believe that the species that the NCRW are referring to have now been reclassified to boa imperata, not boa constrictor. There was a campaign a few years ago for keepers to stop producing bearded dragons in the UK, which resulted in the UK wholesalers having to import farmed bearded dragons from South America due to demand. This is a type of statement, and this type of statement and video discourages those in the hobby and shows off that there are problems within the hobby to animal rights organizations. Your first video was very good, and pose the hobby in a good light, where I feel this will just alienate keepers to your information and campaigns and support the very thing your first video was against. A follow-up from Faye's partner Tom later in the conversation: you don't seem to understand this video isn't on the hobby's side, it's fighting against it. Your last video was on the hobby side. This was the first video, by the way, just to interject, that Responsible Reptile Keeping produced with a presenter refuting the erroneous data surrounding how many animals die within the first year of care and what the mortality rate of captive reptiles is. It's fighting against it. Your last video was on the hobby side. This one is not, and neither was the green iguana one. Personally, I think you should take these down and make a new plan going forward, as this angle you are coming from is not helpful. It is fuel for the fire. So what's my opinion? I've been working with Chris for a bit with regards to how to help the NCRW, and Snakes and Adders teamed up with the NCRW to see if we could help with the rehoming issues. And immediately the conversation when I first touched base with Chris centered around boa constrictors and them being a problem. The fact that they had 40 plus of them at the center, some of which had been on the books since 2019. We can skirt around the edges, but from a rehome perspective, the single biggest burden on the rehoming sector, if we were to use species examples, is boa constrictors. They're not necessarily the most numerous. Of course, corn snakes and royal pythons will probably be higher in number. But then corn snakes and royal pythons will live quite happily in a 4-foot vivarium for the remainder of their life. And there will be a far higher proportion of people capable of providing this level of infrastructure for those animals. So the expedience with which they can be rehomed is a given. And there will always be a demand to rehome these animals. Chris states royals go out, quite regularly and readily. Corn snakes again. The issue is the boas. There's a sticking point. Invariably, the boas that are surrendered are larger boas that have surpassed their baby or grow on vivarium and are now ready for their 6-foot vivarium. And this is a slightly bigger issue for people to be able to navigate. Equally, boas are big, powerful snakes, and that could give people pause for thought about whether they want to take that boa on. So are Responsible Reptile Keeping and Chris Newman wrong to suggest that maybe people take their foot off the gas with regards to the production of boa constrictors? Well, when I say boa, let me clarify. Boa constrictors, that's their full name. That's how we know them. But realistically, Faye and Tom do make a point that the reclassification or the elevation of boa constrictor imperata to boa imperata classifies them by themselves as the common boa or imperial boa. And it is these that we're talking about. We are not talking about boa constrictor, which is the true red-tail boas, which are Suriname, Guyana, and Peru. We're not talking about long-tail boas, boa constrictor longicorda, short-tailed boas, boa constrictor amarali, Argentine boas, boa constrictor occidentalis, or potentially some of the locality dwarf boas, which are still very much sought after, or just generally less problematic and don't really appear as much in the rehoming world. These may be the Chaos Cochinos or Hog Island boas, El Salvador, Crawl K, Cork K, clouded boas, a bunch of other stuff. So we can remove those. I don't think the video, I think maybe they could have clarified it better, which would have led to less consternation. But we're talking about common boas and invariably the wild phenotype, not the morphs, the ones that I've seen put onto the NCRW page and the ones that we shared through our initiative that we arranged with the NCRW called Rehome Wednesdays, which saw 90 animals rehomed, which we're incredibly proud of to have been part of that. And we're going to be looking at ways to try and roll this out across other stores to try and aid the rehoming and be able to promote unity and a sense of shared responsibility for the rehoming of reptiles. Boas are an issue with direct rehome or surrender presented to shops, and I speak as a shop that has had numerous inquiries as to whether we can take boas, which are, if not equal to, only slightly under corn snakes and royal pythons, and invariably we have to say no because there is no room at the inn. And the difficulty with direct rehome and surrender with shops is we are bound by the AAL, which the NCRW is not, which means that there are parameters for sizes of enclosures and things that we can't meet once a boa is a certain size, which renders us useless in the battle to take them on. If that was different and there wasn't those constraints, then maybe Chris wouldn't be seeing the issue that he is, but that's the lie of the land. That's the way things are. We know that shops are the single biggest contributor to rehoming in the UK. The sterling work that Chris does, the work that the Brighton RSPCA, which is a reptile specialist centre, undertakes, and the private rescue network, their work is brilliant. I spearheaded a report for Repta from idea, inception, execution, and analysis on the state of the energy crisis, cost of living crisis, and part of that questionnaire revolved around the work that shops undertake voluntarily for rehome and surrender. And shops are rescuing, over the course of a year, it is estimated 45,000 reptiles. The total annual intake of the entire rescue network is around 6,000 animals per annum. So the shops, you may think we might not know what we're on about or how intrinsically we're involved in the rehome or surrender network, but you would be surprised. We contribute a huge amount and take the animals back in when we can, when it is appropriate. So we have a finger on the pulse of what's going on with what's being surrendered or being asked to be surrendered. Invariably, we have to refer common boas and larger animals, whether they're retics or Burmese, onto the National Centre for Reptile Welfare for them to then try and organise getting these animals back and finding them a home. And that's something that the shops, we can't circumvent, we can't get around it. I think that if you look at other hobbies, we call it hobby, industry, pet sectors, companion animal sectors, it's long known that staffies are a problem species. You know, they were hugely popular in the early 2000s and at one stage occupied the vast majority of rescue and rehoming placements within RSPCA, PDSA, Dogs Trust branches. And then there became the push to rescue and not further produce this species. There is a vast amount of species kept. Snakes, if we just keep 2 snakes, because we're talking about the common boa, that can be bred and reproduced, that you could find homes for, that will still give you the experience of breeding, of reproduction, the magic of watching babies being born or eggs hatching, without necessarily contributing further to an issue that exists. The same way that if somebody was publicly producing Staffordshire Bull Terriers, hand over fist, there would be a certain amount of derision that would come their way from other dog keepers or parties or stakeholders within the dog arena. And I don't necessarily think that it is overly problematic to raise issues. Another issue that was raised in Faye's post about bearded dragons, and then Responsible Reptile Keeping, saying it was ill-researched in their response. So I sit apart from both of those. And the joy here is that I'm not necessarily just on Responsible Reptile Keeping side. I'm not on Faye's side. I'm on my own side. I've got my own opinion. I've got my own brain. I've got my own experience within the hobby. And that means then that conversations can take place and we can have a discussion, hopefully in a cerebral way, that means that we explore issues, and if we can find a way that we can move forward. Bearded dragons at one stage were vastly overbred. This degraded their price, and this meant that they were almost giveaway. That was a problem. The fact that wholesalers couldn't get them because shops were still trying to sell them and still had 50 or God knows how many being produced in store at any one time, and they were shelling like peas going out the door, they degraded the value of an animal to the point where they were almost worthless. And the Incubate 2 project that was started by Taron Boone and somebody else, I can't remember the other guy's name, but that really took a hold. A lot of people distanced themselves from the selling of bearded dragons. I was one of them. I made that choice, and I'm still not overly comfy with selling them. We sell the morphs occasionally, but we'll only ever buy 2 or 3 in. We don't cohabit them when they come, because invariably they maim one another and take toes and tail tips with them, which then means that whatever investment you made in the animals is now worthless, and you've got a maimed animal that you need to find a home for instead. So, you know, production, certain species groups, certain taxa are always going to have a level of consternation. The other issue that we face is that obviously there is pressure coming from the antis, and there is the World Animal Protection Agency, the Born Free, RSPCA. They're not our friends. You can say what you like, the RSPCA are not our friends, not in this hobby. They don't want reptile keeping, and they're one of the main protagonists for putting forward the argument for the whitelist, which is a total farce and a bollocks, which just won't work. Thankfully, we've learned that the Scottish issue, as being discussed, there is no appetite to visit that during this current Parliament, which means that gives us somewhat of a breathing room to be able to formulate proper arguments moving forward, to be able to shut down the idea of the whitelist. But do we ignore problems, or are we proactive? That's the crux of this. Do we willfully ignore issues or not discuss them and not have proper conversations about issues that are faced in the hobby for fear that the antis will get hold of it and use it? Or do we frame it that we are being proactive, and you've long argued as the anti-lobby that we are not proactive and we don't take positive affirmative action if we see an issue coming, and we would sooner deny it? I'd go with the second option. We don't hide issues. I don't think that that's a grown-up way to go about it. I think you have to discuss your issues. You have to acknowledge, yeah, this is not going the way I wanted it to go. This is not how I thought the hobby would be, or this, that, and the other. And I think that maybe we need to have a look at this. We need to discuss this. It isn't that necessarily somebody's making a final decision that suddenly changes things. Nobody, you know, whilst there are people at the top of the hobby, it's not an autocracy. There are no laws preventing you from keeping or breeding whatever you like. And you may watch this, you may watch the Responsible Reptile Keeping video, you might think bollocks to it, I'm going to breed it anyway. That's your choice. But if we can raise an issue and say, you know, at rehoming and surrender level, this species is an issue. It's a problem that we need to deal with, look at, talk about. I don't think that's ever a bad thing. You know, iguanas, mentioned in another video, they've been an issue for years. 2 or 3 in 10, maybe even 2 or 3 in 20, are totally tame, fabulous, grade A pets that you can work with and all the rest of it. The rest can be arseholes, really aggressive. They're huge, require massive enclosures. Their infrastructure requirements as adults are not insignificant. And when they're sold as 30 centimeter, cute as a button, little baby green dragons that just look awesome and just they're so amazing, and I can see the appeal, they're very easy to sell. But then what do you do with them when they're full grown? And as much as shops, and me being one of them, try to filter people and sell things in the right way, there are people that will slip through the net. And there are people that can be quite manipulative, and they know full well that they've got no intention of keeping it for life. Equally, they may also have a change in circumstance, which means that they can no longer keep it. They may also have this energy crisis, which sees personal collections become problematic because of the amount of energy that they use. Although, when we're talking about single animal households, it's insignificant, the rise, and the energy thing is being used to scapegoat people, even with one animal that's on a 14-watt heat pad or a 40-watt spot bulb that uses pence per day. But when you've got 30 or 40 animals in a big diverse collection, and then suddenly your energy has gone from 12 or 13 pence kilowatt hour to 34p a kilowatt hour, that will have a discernible effect on the household's funds, and you may well need to surrender some of your animals. So these things happen, and the discussion is important. It isn't necessarily that I have the answers, it's that the discussion can happen, for one. It can happen publicly, for two, because I don't think that the antis are bringing anything new to the table by saying, see, you have got a problem. Well, you've been telling us we've got a problem for years. You've had a problem with boa constrictors since the year of that. Not only that, you've got a problem with corn snakes, you've got a problem with royal pythons, you've got a problem with everything else. You don't want us to keep the animals. So what are we handing to them? The fact that we are willing to say, rehoming is struggling with this species. Maybe, please, if you don't mind, can we curtail the amount that are being produced to try and alleviate said pressure? How can that be negative? That's just, I just don't get it. I don't get it. I think that Responsible Reptile Keeping produced an excellent video in that first video, which does take it to the antis. We mustn't lose that impetus, and we keep taking it to the antis. Jesus, they've given us enough ammunition, which is just shite, that they've pulled out their arse, that means nothing, that we can still use to refute and create those counter arguments. But that does not mean that we do not discuss issues that we acknowledge exist within this hobby, for fear that the antis are going to hear and they're going to come for us. They're coming for you anyway. Don't matter whether you're discussing the issues or not. It makes no difference. They're coming regardless. So we can either not deal with the boa issue, not deal with the iguana issue, not deal with any other issue that might crop up, or we can discuss it. We can be grown-ups and say, like, okay, so maybe we need to think from an education standpoint whether we raise this as a red flag. People can make their own decisions. If this video that Responsible Reptile Keeping have issued curtails the production of boa constrictors just by a modicum, that is a positive, because those people may well think, well, sod it. Okay, I'll breed a smaller, more manageable boa. I might take on sand boas or rosy boas. I might think, actually, I'm just going to keep the common boas as a pet, but I really like the idea of these Peruvian longtail boas. I really like the idea of these, I don't know, Argentine rainbow boas, which we don't really see in the hobby a vast amount anymore. So there are opportunities to still produce boas, but not common boas. And equally, there are certain ones that are very high value from morphs, and you would think, if we were to apply it logically, that maybe these higher value animals would protect themselves by virtue of the fact that they're worth more money, so they're less likely to lose interest from people or get passed along, because there was a fair amount of monetary investment in there. Money for some people is a dirty word, but for me, sometimes money acts to ring fence the safety of something by virtue of the fact that it's worth money. I don't think Chris is sat on a bunch of IMG boas or super hypo jungle motleys or whatever else. They're common boas. The problem is when you're dealing with the probabilities of producing morphs and cultivars, there is normals being produced. Now, if that was only the case, that's fine, but it's when a full litter of normal common boas is being produced and they're being bred for the sake of it or for the experience of breeding it. Are those not the people that we should sort of say, okay, calm down, maybe don't breed your normal common boas, because the 25 to 40 baby boas that you're going to produce are going to need to find onward homes. And that is the problem. You know, if you're breeding a multi-gene animal, you may produce 4 normal looking common boas that invariably will have got a bunch of heterozygotic traits being carried as well. They're probably less of an issue or less of a burden, or if no just straight common boa litters were being produced, that would reduce numbers. Maybe that was the cut and thrust of the video. Just straight common boa to common boa, no genes involved. That's the issue. Maybe that would be a better way of framing it or coming at this argument. I don't necessarily think Faye's wrong. I don't think Tom's wrong. I don't think responsible reptile keeping is wrong. I think that discussion is key to be able to work through this and then be able to drill down on exactly what it is we're trying to say, make sure that we've got the arguments and counter arguments done. So my advice to Tony or responsible reptile keeping would be, what are people within our own hobby going to say about this? Have we thought through this? And can we include the counter arguments to questions we haven't been asked yet in the videos, meaning that it shows that we have given due diligence and thought to what we're producing? Had the video framed it that common boa to common boa breeding is an issue because you're going to end up with 25 to 40 normal boa constrictors that we're going to struggle to find homes for long term, that needs to stop. If somebody is producing morphs, they're going to produce far less common boas. And I don't think that, as I said, the morphs and cultivars are the main populace of boa constrictors that are an issue at the National Centre for Reptile Welfare. So that would be the way that I would frame it, and that discussion is king, and it's important for us to discuss and work through these issues. And, you know, by all means, comment, share your thoughts. I'm a pretty open book. I sell boas, you know. I'm not free from scorn. Very few shops are. I think moving forward, we're really going to have to look at whether we continue to sell common boas. I don't think that we will. I think morphs, we will probably still continue to sell. But then maybe I'm half-arsing it. Maybe people would go, well, it's still a common boa. You're still, you know, you're still contributing to the issue. And you know what? You could be right. But that's the point of the discussion. So it's from those discussions that arguments for or against are made. Often people are guilty of not committing enough thought to what they're doing. And then when I sit and go, actually, you've got a point there. Maybe I need to think about this. That's what grown-ups do. We don't just rant, rave, shout. We discuss, we think. And I'm not arrogant enough to think that whatever I'm doing now is necessarily the perfect way moving forward. But I will adapt, I will change as necessary. And, you know, that's something that I need to look into. Maybe common boas now, if we get offered babies, I won't buy them, but I would take them in for rehoming, and then they would be rehomed to suitable homes. I mean, currently when we rehome animals, we do it free of charge. Maybe I would need to introduce a rehoming fee, something modest, 15 quid, 10 quid, to cover the cost of food and the girls looking after them while they're in their care. That's something I could look to moving forwards. You see, this is it. Your brain starts going, you start thinking, you start, oh, okay, can adapt. What can we do? But I look forward to these videos from Responsible Reptile Keeping because they raise the opportunity for discussion. I'll keep a close eye on them because if there's anything else I find interesting, I'll post videos to discuss my thoughts. And then obviously people on the shop page or the YouTube channel can join in with those discussions as well. Some people might denounce me as a crank and an idiot, which is fine, it's your right. Then other people might agree. And then, you know, all I would say is that keep the comments respectful. Anybody who gets abusive, I'll just delete the comment. Like, there's no point in that. That's not the point of this. The cut and thrust is, let's have an adult discussion about it. So we'll be back soon with another video. I'll see you again